Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Modern Sales Pros discussion about all things lead attribution and lead scoring. Pretty exciting topic. We've got two of the best in the game to chat with us and get us up to speed on this. Stephen, Niels, I know you're super busy. Thank you for joining us. Excited to have you. You're both first-time panelists on MSP, so we always love to get to know our guests a little bit more before we jump into the content. And I'd love to know from each of you what the next big, exciting travel destination is. Where are you really planning to go on your next vacation? Stephen, let's start with you.
Yeah. So my next big trip is probably going to be St. Lucia. It's going to be, for those who don't know, it's in the Caribbean Sea, which is amazing. It's actually gonna be a company trip. So like our company kind of retreat is gonna be in St. Lucia. So that's gonna be really exciting. It is in November, the first week of November. So we're gonna be there for about a week. Outside of that, I haven't traveled anywhere for the last 18 months. So I'm very excited to get out there. So pending the outcome of everything going on, hopefully everything works out as planned, but that's where I'll be.
I love it. And now would be the important time to drop the career page for your company in the chat panel for those who also want to tag along to St. Lucia. Just a thought.
We're hiring.
Niels, how about you? Where are you excited to head to once you finally break out and travel?
Yeah, I am going to put the St. Lucia in the company suggestion box here for consideration. But for me, I'm just happy to get out of the house in any way, shape, or form. But we're actually making a trip up to Portland here at the beginning of September for a family wedding, and then we're going to stay over, do a little Pacific Northwest exploration for a couple days and hang out. I really like the Portland area. Lots of really cool, eclectic downtown, good food and that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to do.
Awesome. So if we make it through this lead attribution and scoring thing, I mean, we've got kind of a world tour that we could go and hit St. Lucia, hit Portland, and then go from there. But folks, we're going to jump into this. We got a lot to cover here today. Stephen, if you advance the slide once. As I mentioned at the outset, today's session is hosted by the team at Modern Sales Pros. For those of you who don't know, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest revenue leadership community. And our mission is to create an environment for our community members that can help them answer questions that otherwise struggle to solve on their own. So we do that through bringing together great panelists and great content like what we have today through a robust online forum. And in the future, we'll get back to in-person events. Everything we do is free for community members. And for those of you who aren't, you'll be invited to join afterwards. Today's session wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship from the team at Trey. You're going to hear more about Trey from Niels here in a second, but really, really happy to be working with them. Exciting stuff that they've got going on. And I'm really glad that we have the chance to meet Niels and Stephen as part of this. So Stephen, Niels, thank you again so much for everything. And I'll hand it over to you to take us on into it.
Thanks. Good to be here. So this is the topics that we're going to be covering and then the agenda. So we're going to do a speaker intros, challenges. We're going to cover the challenges within the modern RevOps stack as well as go through the lead attribution models. So I'm going to cover about, I think, 5 to 6 of the most common ones that you might run into. And then we're going to dive into the attribution models and how you can make the most of the data, as well as how to initiate the lead scoring. And then we'll open it up to QA toward the end of the webinar. Since I'm already speaking, I'll just dive right in of who I am, and then I'll pass it over to Niels. So my name is Stephen Stouffer, as previously mentioned. I'm the VP of Marketing Operations here at SaaScend. SaaScend is a RevOps agency, so we help all sorts of clients through multi-touch attribution, as well as scoring and grading models. We're agnostic to the system that you use, so we work with HubSpot, we work with Marketo, we work with Pardot, all the big players, as well as something like Salesforce, of course, gets kind of tied in there. So we help build the models, we build the strategy, all the way down to implementation. More about me. Been in the space for about 9 years. Started out as an analyst and moved into marketing automation. And then that very logically turned into marketing operations, which brings me here to SaaScend. So it's a little bit about me. Located here in Dallas, Texas. And if it gets dark where I am, there's a storm rolling in. So hopefully I don't become a shadow on everyone's screen. But All right, Niels.
Thanks, Stephen. So yes, I work for Tray.io as the head of growth. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Tray, we're what we sort of term as a low-code general automation platform, which essentially is used by a lot of folks, probably in titles that are in this webinar, as a platform to help connect and automate different systems and processes across the RevOps stack. One of the things that I think we're trying to do as an organization is really empower people in roles who have previously been maybe frustrated with their technology and making it work for their business, and just making solving those problems far more accessible to a broader set of operations people, technologists, people who are trying to, again, make their software systems work for them in a better way. As far as what I do at the Tray organization, essentially, so I sit in the marketing organization, and one of the primary areas that I focus on is marketing operations. So we do all things sort of marketing technology for the department, and specifically, one of the big focus areas that we have is sort of the whole lead lifecycle. Everything from ingesting to enrichment to routing, scoring, attribution, all that sort of stuff are things that we deal with every single day, and hence the reason I'm here.
Nice. I always wondered what you did. Now I know. Why does attribution matter? So this slide is really important because it kind of sets the foundation for our entire conversation. So I'm going to take a stab at this from my perspective, and then Niels, if you want to layer on your perspective, by all means, feel free to correct me. But attribution, at the very top level, it matters because you need a lens to look through your business that is not biased. So marketing has their own agenda, sales has theirs. Best case scenario, they're aligned, and you can kind of look through the business through a particular lens and then measure it. Attribution is a way to objectively measure results of the different activities that a company can be doing. That way, there's not any one person saying, oh, I did this and it's contributed to X, Y, and Z because I said so. You have a model to push it against where everyone is being measured through the same lens, essentially. Niels?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And, like sort of the subjective sort of scorekeeping for the business to understand, is our strategy working? Are the different tactics that we're sort of iterating on and changing over the course of time making a difference? And I'd say, the only thing I might just sort of add to that is like, it's sort of an ongoing process, right? Like I don't view attribution as something that like, oh, we did that initiative in Q3, right? Like now we're done and everything's working fine and we'll look at it again in a year. Like one of the things I think that's really critical for your attribution process is to constantly be evaluating it and deciding if its current state still meets the needs of what the business is trying to do. So it's just something to always keep an eye on. And it's not that you should always be changing it necessarily, but I think you should always have an eye towards like, is it suiting the needs of what the business is doing? So I think sometimes we underappreciate, right, the importance of it sometimes, and just set it and forget it is just not a mentality I would encourage.
Yeah, I'd add to that too, depending on how long your buying cycle is, which I'm going to bring up in a few different models, which might actually be a good segue into it. If your buying cycle is really, really long, you have to give it time to work. So you have the data to look back on, but if it's shorter, you kind of have the luxury of having a shorter time frame to do a look back, just to kind of do those kind of spot checks. Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to tweak it here or there? All right, so we've sprinkled in audience questions. So when you registered for the event, there's like an open box where you could fill in and put in some questions. So if you see your question here, that's where we got it from. So have you tackled multi-touch attribution? Are there any resources you can share to get expert level on attribution? I'll take a stab at this. And then Niels, if you want to do it too. So Modern Sales Pros is probably a really great place to start. You can submit your question. It's a community full of amazingly and smart, talented people. I would say put your question there, and I'm sure you're going to get some fun results. As well as there's some resources that I can share, or if the moderators want to go and track it down out there. I know Segment does a really good one about all the different models I'm going to go over. But I would say start with the Modern Sales Pros, or if you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to have a conversation and dive deep. It's what I do every day, every week. Niels, do you have a more actionable?
I was going to say, did Richard
feedback?
tee you up for that? Was that the softball answer that he planted inside the
That's the
presentation?
only answer. Move on. Next question.
No, I mean, I think you made a good point on this, the length of the sales cycle and sort of matching your attribution model to whatever it is that makes sense for your business. Like for us, we actually have two product lines, right? And one is a super fast, like very first touch centric like model, and another one's like a really drawn out one. And so it does make a difference, in terms of. But I'm sure you'll unpack that here more.
Yeah, and I would say too, before you even start thinking about multi-touch attribution, like it sounds like this person is just starting out. I would understand the business and understand it really, really well. Like you cannot implement something like an attribution model without understanding what marketing is doing, understanding what sales is doing, understanding how they're doing it, what the current process is. So I would almost unpack that first, and then dive into the models, which I'm going to do here in a second, and see which model makes the most sense based off of, how long your buying cycle is, what are the different campaigns, what's the structure of that, which is probably a good segue for me just to dive into that. But if you have a specific question around like, hey, what do I read? What webinar, what ebook? There's a really great page from Segment about attribution models. Maybe someone can just drop in that I really like. So what are the different models? I'm going to go through each one of these pretty quickly, but then I'm going to also layer on the types of people who would maybe be interested in seeing the business through this lens. And Niels, interrupt me if you have something to add here. I'll go pretty quick, but just interrupt me if you have something. So attribution has to do with touch points that happen prior towards an opportunity being created or entering pipeline. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you might have a stage 0 or a stage 1 opportunity that isn't in pipeline, maybe enters pipeline during the opportunity life cycle, but I'm not going to get into that. Typically it's prior to it being created. So first touch is the first campaign that a lead or a contact or person, depending what system or tool you have, touched prior to an opportunity being open. So let's say I hit the website for the first time through a LinkedIn lead gen form. It was paid media. I then hit the website. I fill out the form. An opportunity then gets created. That dollar value for that opportunity 100% is going to be associated with that lead gen form being filled out for LinkedIn. So it'd be paid social, LinkedIn. That's where the attribution is happening with first touch. Last touch, the exact opposite. So what was the last activity or campaign that a contact or lead interacted with prior to an opportunity being created? So say I came in through LinkedIn, but then I kind of fell off the funnel, went through a nurture program, and then ended up seeing an ad on Facebook. I clicked that. That was my last touch. Opportunity got created. 100% of the value happened to last touch. Now, why would we care about these two different models? So first touch would be really good for maybe the marketing manager or a campaign manager, top of funnel. They want to know where stuff is coming from, what's feeding the funnel, what are all those activities that are basically pulling people in the pipeline. If you have a really long buying cycle, first touch maybe might not be that interesting. So like a lot of campaign managers, a lot of specialists, a lot of marketing folks care about first touch because that's like the foot in the door for everything else that you can do. So it's just basically creating that, de-anonymizing the IP address into a person. Last touch is really interesting. This can be a little biased because what I've typically seen is last touch is almost always sales because they're in the pipeline, they're going through nurture programs. Sales is typically engaging. So there's some sort of email, phone call activity that happened prior to an opportunity being created. So it's a little more biased towards sales. So like if you're a VP of sales or a director of sales, or some in sort of leadership of sales, this could be really interesting because this is going to tell you what sales activities are leading to an opportunity being opened, or if marketing's in the mix where they're involved in the sales kind of outreach programs, you might also see marketing as well. I'm gonna pause there. Niels, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I mean, nothing materially at this point. I'd just say, right, all of this is ultimately a data challenge, right? Which I think we'll get into in a little bit. And so I guess one of the things I might say is like, I'm very much a proponent of all the data, please. So just like the concept of ensuring that all your touches are reliably recorded, because then you can sort of manipulate your models. But that is like basics, right? Like fundamentals. Like you have to really be on point for making sure you're capturing each of these touches that way you can iterate on it, right? You can sort of draw the lines a little bit differently over time.
Yeah, it only works if you know what the first touch is and you know what the last touch is and you know what the middle touches is. So like getting those fundamentals in place are important, which I'll go over in a little bit. Even touch, it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's basically a non-bias. Every touch point basically has the same value. Webinar, ebooks, infographics, email, nurture, essentially every campaign association that happens is just spread evenly amongst that opportunity value. So the person who might be interested in this would be maybe the CMO. CMO might be interested in just all of the activities. What are we doing? What's working? What's not working? Now we get to a little more of the complex models. So U-shaped, in my opinion, is probably the best model out of all of these because without the first touch, you wouldn't have that foot in the door experience. Without the last touch, you would maybe not even have had an opportunity. So both those touch points need to be taken into account, but I don't think necessarily 100% of the value should be weighted one way or the other. I should preface this by saying it depends on the business. So like, while I've found this one to be the most relevant for most of the clients that I've worked with, if you have a really long buying cycle, the W-shaped model might make sense where there's like a middle point where there's some sort of big event that needs to happen for a big, massive deal. And it's going to be going on for maybe 2 years. Or if you have like a free trial and you have kind of like the beginning, the middle, the end, and it's very well defined, the W shape might make a lot of sense, but if what I just said, you don't clearly understand, or you clearly don't have like that, like, oh yeah, this would be like the middle of the kind of the life cycle of a lead. If you don't have a very clear idea what that is, W shaped is probably not for you. But it is very useful in very long buying cycles where you kind of have a very clearly defined beginning, middle, and end to a deal. Custom. This is really tricky. It seems really interesting, but it can get very sticky real quick. So the idea behind a custom model, and this goes in a little bit to what Niels was saying, where it's not set it and forget it. It's kind of launch it and monitor and kind of tweak along the way. This allows for a lot of tweaking. The idea for a custom model is not all campaigns, not all actions are the same. An email click shouldn't be the equivalent to a demo request, or it shouldn't be the equivalent to a free trial. So it's basically weighting the different campaigns, weighting the different action points appropriately. So you're not saying, maybe an email click is contributing 30%. That doesn't make any sense. So maybe that would be 5%. And then you can kind of coordinate accordingly. The tricky part about this is how do you weight? How do you weight all of what marketing's doing? And I've typically found that that's tied to budget and planning of where are the resources within marketing being kind of allocated, and then you're weighting appropriately. So if the majority of the budget is going towards webinars, it doesn't make sense to weight them at 5%. You probably should bump that up to something like 30, because that is where the majority of your budget is going. That is where the initiative is being pushed. And then everything else kind of, you can figure out where it falls in line based on the marketing priorities and roadmap. Time decay. So this is kind of what you'd expect. So over time, activities, especially for longer buying cycles, activities can happen over a year, 2 years, 3 years. And this basically allows you to say, if you did an activity 2 years ago and you're just now opening an opportunity, that activity probably shouldn't be weighed any sort of significant way, because the more recent activities should be weighed higher, right? Because those likely influenced you. That LinkedIn lead gen for or ad that you clicked in, or that ebook that you got, 2, 3, 4 years ago, it shouldn't really be factored into the model because it's just so old of an activity. All right. So what are the fundamentals? I'm going to just kind of breeze through this because I cover it in the next couple of slides, but campaign hierarchies are really important. This is a little bit Salesforce focused. So I'm kind of having the assumption that you have some sort of CRM or some sort of campaign strategy that you built. So just be aware of that. We typically like seeing a grandparent, parent, child campaign relationship. So grandparent would be like the solution or the product. The parent would be the asset, ebook, white paper, infographic, and then the child would be the tactics. So Facebook, lead gen forms, Twitter, email campaigns, that kind of stuff. And then for URLs, a lot of people do attribution in different ways. I found the most scalable solution is around the UTM parameters. So being able to leverage the 5 out-of-the-box Google UTM parameters, as well as layer on a few custom URL parameters like campaign ID and member status, which are really important to pass down through the form in order to have that campaign association happen within Salesforce. So it's a very scalable solution in that you can have, one landing page, 15 different tactics pointing to it, and then you can kind of splice and dice people into campaigns appropriately and then report on it off of the model. And then process, consistency, naming conventions, scalability, repeatability, these are all really important. I can't tell you how many businesses I've seen have had a really solid process, but the process wasn't scalable. It wasn't repeatable. It was super, super manual. And while it got them to exactly what they needed, the business just couldn't scale. And you had maybe a team member spending a whole lot of time doing manual processes, even though it got you where you needed to go, but you had, 5 people doing manual tasks when they really didn't need to be. All right. So this is just kind of a visualization of how to implement something like UTM parameters and how it kind of functions. So on the left-hand side, you have a paid media ad or like an email. You have encoded URLs with UTMs. Basically, it's a way to pass information from some sort of initiative into a form. So the form wouldn't look like this. It kind of pulled back the curtain a little bit from what you would maybe see as an end user, but what's in red is what the lead would be filling in, and what's in blue is actually hidden fields. So these don't actually show up on a form. They're behind the scenes data that's being captured through the form and then pushed into your CRM. So then we can do attribution appropriately. So latest campaign ID, this associates the campaign to the campaign in your CRM, what they did, they clicked, they downloaded, they requested a demo. The campaign that it's tied to, so in this case, a newsletter, the medium, email, source, SaaScend, and you can kind of get a picture of how we're capturing these granular touches and then pulling them into the CRM. And then when it comes to scalability, so this is something that our team uses. Let me just make this bigger. So when we talk about all these different campaigns and all these different tactics that you have to create, and having it be scalable and repeatable, we found that doing something like this with Salesforce campaigns is really effective. So what it does is it creates all of your campaigns at once. That way you're not having to create individual campaigns, building the hierarchy, and then go into the Google UTM builder. We enter all that information here. So the campaign name, it's RevOps is the solution, the start date, the campaign type is a webinar. We put in the URL where we want to advertise the page. And then we toggle on the different tactics that we want to use. So in this case, let's do paid media. We're going to do LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We'll do some organic social, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, and then we'll do an email campaign. So I'll just toggle that on and click nurture. And then when I click next, it creates all of these campaigns, puts them in the correct hierarchy, and then it generates the URLs that we need to use within our paid media channels. So here's one of the child campaigns. Let me just, I forget which one I selected. This is a video. Oh, direct. So, well, which one did I select? Twitter? No, I don't remember. Here we go. So in this case here, this is a direct outreach, I think, for mail. You can see here, like there's different campaign member statuses based off of the tactic. and then the attribution link that was generated here, all within Salesforce. So like this is a very scalable solution, right? You don't need to have a campaign manager go in, creating a bunch of manual campaigns, creating a bunch of URLs, documenting them into a spreadsheet. It's all nice and neat within Salesforce. It's very simple. And we just created, I think, 9 different campaigns within 15, 20 seconds with this appropriate URLs with the UTMs on them. So if anyone has any questions on how we did that, how it looks, how it's built, feel free to reach out. All right, go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So this is kind of the tail end, like this is the outcome, right? So once we have the UTMs, the campaigns, we're tracking everything, it's being passed down through the forms. This is what we're trying to get to, right? We're trying to get to the revenue. We're trying to get to the closed won deals. So this is what you can expect as far as an outcome with attribution, where you have filters at the top of the report. You can filter by different campaign types. You can filter by campaign subtypes. Here at SaaScend anyway, we've even built in filters for different models. So like if you want to flip through one lens through another, U-shaped, W, first touch, last touch, we could include that, or you could include that within a drop-down menu in order to look through the entire business through one model or another model. So it gets interesting really quick, but like Niels was saying, having the data clean and just actionable is just so important. All right, for optional reporting.
So I think, Stephen, you addressed some of this stuff, and what I'd like to do is just kind of do what I'm calling a sort of open source RevOps sort of talk, which is to say, okay, like we've talked about some principles about different models, about the importance of quality data. How does that actually work at Tray? And I think it relates to Eric's question, which was, how are you solving data issues? If you can go next slide. I'll try to address that in terms of how we do it at Tray, because this is how I think a lot of ops people feel. We call it the attribution problem, right? Which is to say, have you ever tried to get a cat to do what you want? That's what it feels like to me a lot of the times when you're talking about software systems. Is a lot of times you deal with out of the box integrations between marketing automation and CRM, tons of different lead sources, whether that's through ad vendors or list uploads or website forms or third party, systems, whatever it is, right? You have this, it's almost like you're a dog walker and your software systems are these crazy dogs and cats who are just pulling you along, and you're trying to harness that, and really, I guess in a biased way, I think there's a way better way, and a lot of that has to do with new solutions on the market, like Tray. So if you go next slide, I'll show you what I mean. So just quickly in terms of how we're doing attribution, right? So to Stephen's point, on the far left, we're collecting a lot of lead metadata that has to do with touches, right? So whether it's the UTMs, it's the Salesforce campaigns that are associated to a particular form that someone's filling out, the referrers that's driving people to our website, or the offers that they're converting, right? We're capturing that all. I don't think this is anything too earth-shattering. We all do that, but then what we do is we try to essentially use a standardized process to bucket those things into what we call a lead source, right? So that'll be your paid, organic, direct, social, whatever sort of buckets make sense for you. And then ultimately what that rolls up into is what we would call a lead source type. And so Anil asked the question, how do you balance a nuanced attribution model to make it simple enough for your exec and stakeholders? And this is our approach to that, which is to basically progressively roll it up to higher and higher level categorizations, so that certain levels of the business, we can give them what they care about. So for example, on the lead source type, our head of biz ops she's super focused right now on the question of what selling motions are driving pipeline and revenue right now, right? And so we have to bucket it in very simple terms. We don't sort of expose that level of the business to the nitty gritty detail that sort of as you work your way down to the left, but our acquisition team who's bidding on keywords and pushing on SEO, right? They care a lot about the sort of metadata data level. As far as where we collect them, what objects, for us, we collect first and touch, last touch attributes at the lead and contact level. First touch only gets written once. Last touch always gets written every single time. And we do all this data you see here, like we have it for first and last touch on the lead and contact. As far as campaign members, those are where we do what I'm calling like an each touch attribute. So every campaign member literally has this same attribution data that you're seeing at the top level written to it whenever we create that campaign member. I just wanted to make a quick note on opportunity contact roles. So the way we do our attribution is we basically look at all the contact roles that are associated to an opportunity. And then we look at their attribution data to build our models. That's like a really fast way to describe a kind of complex problem. But we're very lucky, I would say, in that we invested early in our data team. And I'll talk to this later in the presentation, but that is a key thing to think about, right? Is when and how do you invest in a data team? Because what they can do from an attribution standpoint is incredibly helpful. And so in any case, can we go next slide, Stephen?
Sure.
Okay, so how do we address our data problems? So I have this sort of like packaging of what I'm calling RevOps microservices. This was just another way to say that with tools like low code, what you can actually do is a lot of your operational processes can be packaged and bundled into these very small in scope services that handle things in a consistent and standardized way that are very small in scope. And when you have these processes for how you handle your attribution data standardized and sort of able to be called in and of themselves, you can orchestrate them in a standard way. And this is like kind of conceptual. So I'll actually show you what I mean if you can go to the next slide. So the way we approach this is we have what we call a processing pipeline. And so our processing pipeline is simply a series of RevOps microservices, so essentially processes that are built on top of our platform, which conduct all the jobs to be done of the lead lifecycle. And those processes are orchestrated. So this processing pipeline is a workflow in and of itself that no matter where our leads come from, I don't care whether they come from our website, whether they come from a CSV upload, whether they come from an ad vendor, whatever it is, I really don't care. Those sources have an intake workflow, which is where our lead metadata is collected. And then they all go through the exact same pipeline, which is this orchestration of these series of processes, which allow us to have extreme visibility into what's happening at every single step of the lead lifecycle, which means I know exactly when and where I write my attributes for every single lead source the same way every single time. So for example, like all of our first touch attributes are written at our creation step in our pipeline. All of our last and each touch attributes always happen in our attribution process, which it does two things. It updates the leader contact with those last touch attributes, and it creates a campaign membership with those each touch attributes. Every single time, the same way I can look at the logs of this process, and I can literally find the exact lead and the exact last time I stamped that, and it happens the same way every time. It's probably not terribly different than some other sort of models with different automation platforms, but I think one of the key things I want to mention here is the level of transparency that we have. Like literally, I can just pull that process up, put a lead ID into the logs, press search, and I can see the exact moment where I stamped that data. The other thing I'll say that we do here is we warehouse all of our Salesforce data aggressively. So we use Segment as like a pipeline to our data warehouse from Salesforce to data warehouse, which means that we can actually like pretty aggressively look at the values that are being stamped on these fields and find discrepancies. And then finally, the other thing that's not really represented here that we do is we actually do a lot of like required field validation inside these processes. So we'll literally Slack our operations channel anytime somebody uses a data value that's incorrect or missing. And so it'll literally say, hey, this person from this campaign put the wrong value in, go tell them to fix it. And so you can do a lot of that with automation platforms. If we can go next slide.
Sure.
If you're interested in like how this sort of works, there's a couple different blog post series that you can check out from a resources standpoint. Just Google RevOps microservices. And unfortunately, I'm not in first position, but the second two links are both a blog post series that like really dive into this and unpack quite literally how every step of the process works. So you can read along and see if that would make sense for you. Next slide.
You're battling with Forbes there.
Okay, so there's an audience question here. How could we be less dependent on sales team processes, CRM adoption, and still have good attribution? So for me, like, again, I'm probably a little biased here, but the answer is like really good. One of the ways that we do this is just really good automation, right? So I mentioned like having built into your processes, like validation process, or having strong data warehousing and just like being able to look at your data in an aggregate view and understand when things are getting off track. That's essentially how we do it. Stephen, I don't know if you guys have anything different from your side, but.
Yeah, this person's probably not going to like my answer. Marketing and sales is a partnership. It shouldn't be like, how do I, make sales do what they're supposed to, or how do I account for the errors that they're going to make? I think you need to account within your automations for user errors, not necessarily sales errors, but if sales processes are not in place to where they have standardized lead sources, or if they can edit the lead source, or if they don't associate context with opportunities is a big one that I see. So making sure that you can lock it down. So partnering with sales, making sure that there's training, that they understand the impact of what you're asking them to do is probably step one. And then just closing the gaps with system tweaks and edits. Like you cannot open an opportunity or create an opportunity if you don't associate a contact, which is huge for attribution, having that contact on it. So I'd say, don't look at them at the enemy as the enemy, look at them as an opportunity for sales and marketing to realign and make sure that you're explaining the importance. And it's not just one more thing that you want sales to do to help out marketing, but it's going to really, at the end of the day, help them out, because I'm sure all of the sales leadership dashboards and stuff are fed off of this data. And if they're not in there, they're missing out revenue associated to the individual sales users.
Okay, Richard, how are we doing on time?
God, you get about 15-20 minutes to go, so a little bit. It's good content, and I know there's a lot here to unpack for the audience.
Yeah, we might. Okay, I think we kind of address this later in the presentation. So Stephen, if we can, I just want to make sure we get to the scoring portion of the webinar. All right, so I am big on this concept of essentialism. Okay, so essentialism is basically the principle that most things are noise in terms of what you're doing in your day-to-day life. And you have to aggressively pursue like the things that are truly critical, and aggressively like push the things that are interesting and important, but maybe not critical to the side in life. And right, so this is sort of my concept here, right? Like, so MTA, it's like, to me, a very sexy and advanced concept if from an attribution standpoint. This is my perspective. Stephen, you might disagree, but like, to me, what is essential is like solid process, great, like reliable data that we all believe in, right? Good reporting and tooling first. So my basic proposal here is don't rush too quickly into the advanced if you don't truly have the fundamentals down, right? Get really good at your first touch attribution before, and ensuring that you can tie that to pipeline before you take on that MTA vendor or project or whatever. Like, be careful. Because it's real easy to get your ops team sucked into cycles of things that you may not be ready for yet. I would say the other part here is like, you cannot have a throw it over the wall mentality. between like the sort of strategic leadership level and the ops level, right? Like we all need to be at the table having a conversation around the analysis of our pipeline and attribution models and the strategy of where the business is going. Because if you're kind of throwing it over the fence and you don't have a seat at the table, like it's just too much telephone game. And so that's a pretty common theme, right? Sales, marketing, like business alignment, but like we always have to keep reminding ourselves how important it is for us to all be at that table. So those would be like, to me, like the core themes of things that I've learned over, really hammering on this problem for a while.
So Niels, I'm going to ask you a question. If the ops team at a company is not at the table, what do you recommend to get them at the table?
I mean, that's a leadership thing, right? Like if you're to me, that's like a sign of a fundamentally broken like leadership problem. Like if the people who are responsible for like making sure that the score is well kept are not involved in those discussions, then to me, you fundamentally are not thinking about the problem correctly. Like these are cross-functional, multidisciplinary challenges, right? Like you have analysts who need to understand the data, you have technologists who need to make sure that it's quality, you have leaders who need to make sure that the strategy is like being executed well upon. To me, that is like leaders need to ask themselves that question. Like why are we not involving the folks, or do we not have the right people on the team? That might be another thing, right? If you don't think that you have the right I don't know if it's a question of like time or capacity, but it might be a hiring thing as well. So that's my gut reaction.
Cool. Why does scoring matter, Niels?
Okay, scoring. Okay, this is a fun one. Scoring, right? We want to make sure that we're prioritizing the right activities as far as marketing, right? So we want to be using and promoting tactics that actually have an impact on pipeline, right? And I always like to think of scoring as like a prediction of likelihood to generate pipeline. And it also helps sales prioritize who they're following up with, because it's very easy, right? If you take a sales essentialist point of view, right? There's a lot of noise out there, right? So where do I really put my focused time and energy in terms of our prospects to those who are most likely to generate pipeline? So at the end of the day, right, that's what I think it's ultimately about. If we can go next slide. All right, so the question is, how can I start to use my past data to improve our existing lead scoring? This to me sort of alludes to one of the points I made earlier in the presentation, if you can go to the next slide, which is the importance of investing in your data early. It can seem quite expensive, resource intensive, and all those sorts of things, but like you have to really start thinking about how you're operationalizing it and using it in different ways. So what I mean by that is like we aggressively, again, like warehouse all of our data. We invested early in our data engineering team and our analyst function in order to really tell us what is driving pipeline. And so what you're actually looking at here is sort of the foundation to our lead scoring model. We had an analyst basically look at all of our historical data in terms of like pipeline and all the attribution points that I had mentioned earlier, and basically like tell us, or the challenge to them was create a model which will be highly predictive of pipeline, right? And so orange dots, good, pipeline. And so if we can go on to the next one, because I know we're a little tight on time here. What that ultimately ended up becoming, if you can give me one more click, please. There might be a smoothie getting blended in the background, so apologies if you hear that. Was what we would call a lead score quadrant. And so what we did is we have two axes which we score our leads on. One is what we would call a fit. A fit score is more demographic, firmographic in nature. It's sort of describing who the prospect is. Do they meet our ICP? And a behavior score is a separate component, which is essentially how much intent are they demonstrating as a person. Those two factors combined make up our lead score. So if we can go to the next slide. This is essentially the exact same thing I just said quickly, which is, again, demographics, firmographics on one side, intent or behavior on the other side. We need to roll that up, simplify it. So we bucket it into the different, into the two different letter representing our fit score, number representing our behavior or intent score. If you can go to the next one. And the way that we apply that, the way that we actually do that is we do it two ways. So one is that we do it real time. Like when somebody comes into our funnel, we basically have this model that our data team knows is predictive of pipeline. And then we score it real time in our process, which basically generates all of our leads. And then we have a batch process that runs every 3 hours that basically pulls that data out of the warehouse. And for anybody who's sort of changed on either one of those dimensions, we updated that in Salesforce. If we can go to the next slide. So the question then becomes, well, how do you use it? Like how do you actually, it's one thing to score it, but how do you prioritize and operationalize that, right? So we actually use that to influence our routing rules. So for example, in the commercial segment, we know we have a fast sales cycle, right? And we don't want to necessarily tie up our SDR resources on all those leads, because those SDR resources are better spent in the longer sales cycle up market. So we actually route all of our high fit, high behaviors directly to our commercial AEs, right? So we'll pass that to our process, which has our rules, and the rules workflow say, hey, okay, high commercial lead, high fit, route to commercial AE. Then we'll also pass that same set to our sequencing process, which will then put them in a fit sequence, which has a higher amount of faster SLA and a higher number of touches with multiple channels, right? So we actually try to use that operationally. And again, like we have these microservices, if you will, which can quickly be iterated upon, so we can change the way we like operationalize this data quickly. I'm sorry I'm flying through this. I just know we're coming up quick. So if you can go one more slide, Stephen, this is just a representation of that, right? So if we get an A-fit lead coming in, we know we need to touch that lead within 2 hours. And we know every time we have a touch, we got to do it fast, and we're going to do it through multiple channels, right? So and all of those are, again, corresponding to what pushes pipeline. Okay, that was lightning fast.
That answered the question. How do you handle the leads differently, like from, based on the score or the grade? So that's very helpful.
Good. Okay, great. So yeah, so I think at the highest level, again, like if you don't have a large volume of data, right, where you can, or you're not blessed with like endless resources of analysts who can create these regression models and high propensity. The question is like, okay, then what, right? Because we don't all get to be there right away. So Stephen, I don't know if that's something you guys, have to tackle in your day-to-days, but it might be good to hear a different perspective there.
Yeah, I'll just make it quick. So if you're trying to figure out where to start with scoring and grading, like you don't know who your ICP is, and you're just trying to discover what that is, you can look either for closed won deals if you have any sort of historic data on the contacts or the leads on those closed won opportunities. Who are they? Who did you talk to? What are their titles? What types of companies there are? Or if you don't have the historic data and you have a website, figuring out who your website visitors are, figuring out who's looking for you and searching for you. So Google Search Console can tell you some information of what people are interested in. Clearbit just now released a new free product where they can de-anonymize some of your website traffic. So like that might be interesting and a free way to kind of go in and figure out, who's on your site, who's looking at you. It'll tell you the revenue range, the industry that they're in, that kind of stuff. Christina, if you're listening, if you want to drop in the link in the chat, it's a free service that they recently released, which is pretty cool, I think. And using any sort of data in your marketing automation tool for form fills or anything. So I would just start there. Like if you have the data, great. If you don't, look to your website, implement something like Clearbit released where you can de-anonymize some of that traffic and figure out, where that traffic is coming from and what kind of companies are interested in you.
One point I did want to mention to be a little careful of, just to keep in mind, is that when using like historical data, it's not always that your go-to-market strategy should be dependent on your historical data. It's like a weird caveat, right? Because you have this like data set which tells you about propensity to score, which is good, right? Like you do want to operationalize, you do want to think about it. But sometimes your go-to-market strategy shifts, right? Like so let's say that you have like a high propensity to close for a commercial account, but you have high churn in commercial, and it's like, oh, that's not working. Like it's great if we can land them all, but they all just kind of fall out the backside, right? After a year, then you may need to re-index, so to speak. So like, yeah, you might be great at closing these accounts, but if the acquisition cost is too high, or the churn's too high, or those sorts of things, or you're trying to go up market, right, and you're trying to change your selling motion, you do have to be thoughtful about what the implications of a score, because it might prevent the behavior changes you need to change in order to, like, as your go-to-market strategy changes, right? So it's not a panacea, right? Like there's all things, right? You have to be having active conversations about the implications of your operational decisions, right? And if you need to change tact because it's just you going after the enterprise, right? It's a totally different motion, then you have to keep that in mind as well.
Cool. Richard, how are we doing on time?
I mean, that was lightning quick, and I think we're moving on to key takeaways, which is where we would go next anyways. Look at that.
All right, I'll cover the first one, and then Niels, if you want to cover the second one. So lead attribution tips. Outside of just understanding the business really, really well before you do anything, one of my like core principles for me and my team is don't try to fix something if you don't understand how it works. So like start there. Don't touch anything unless you know the ins and outs and the nuances between all the teams that it would affect. But your systems must be connected. You got to prioritize data hygiene and cleaning that up. There's a lot of tools out there that let you do it, including Tray. And then you have to have a consistent process. So you got to have those repeatable, scalable processes that I talked about earlier, where it doesn't matter if anything else is going smoothly. If it takes you 10 hours to create a campaign, you're just not going to be able to scale the business. And your ops team are just going to be constantly bogged down on just one-off bug fixes. And it's going to just drain the department, drain the team, and it's just not going to be scalable.
Yep. And on the lead scoring side, right, like when and where possible, leverage your historical data, whether that's through you're at the point where you can have a data team conducting analysis and sort of building your statistical models, or just old-fashioned spreadsheet, right? Love. But we always want to, again, think about what's pushing and generating pipeline. Operationalize your scoring in terms of your SLAs, right? So your higher scored leads are going to get more touches more frequently, multi-channel, right? Your lower scored leads automate as much as possible. Consider both ICP fit like data relative or intent data, right? So it's sort of a multi-dimensional approach. And yeah, that would be my takeaways.
Cool. And on the data hygiene bit, because I know a question was asked by Eric about how are we solving for data issues. I'll tell you how I solve for it. So you can crack down on the form, so you can make sure that you're getting business email addresses. There's some validation scripts that you can put on there if the native marketing automation platform doesn't have it. I leverage Clearbit a lot. I use something like Bright Verify for checking to see if the domain is valid. But Clearbit, at least for me, is a big one that I use a lot for, asking minimal amount of information on a form, but getting maximum return on the attributes that you need to kind of run your business, like revenue tier and number of employees or anything like that, or geo information based off of routing that you may just not want to clutter up your form with, to keep it simple and clean for high conversions.
Well, gentlemen, when we put on a master class, we generally like to let the chefs cook, as it were. And this was absolutely a master class in the true sense of the words, covering all of the things about lead attribution and lead scoring. I feel like each one of those, we could have gone on for another 45 minutes. which was great. You know, Stephen, Niels, I know you're both really, really busy. I appreciate you taking some time to pull this content together and share your perspective with the community. Certainly a ton of great insights in here, and we look forward to doing it again real soon. So on behalf of the team behind the scenes, everyone in the community and those watching on YouTube, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day and stay safe.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.